People were watching a movie at a drive-in theater, and one of them was a man named Harlan. He's an arrogant former soldier, but now he became a drug dealer. When Harlan was drinking with his girlfriend, he suddenly choked. Seeing this, his girlfriend just laughed and told him to be careful. But the arrogant Harlan got angry and tortured his girlfriend. One of the visitors saw Harlan torturing his girlfriend and then tried to stop him. However, Harlan didn't like other people interfering in his business, so he immediately beat the man up. After beating up the man, Harlan left, leaving his girlfriend alone. Meanwhile, in a metal factory, one of the employees, Russell, has worked there for 3 years, and almost every day he spends his time working. On his way home, Russell saw his younger brother's car parked at a horse racing place bet. Russell immediately parked his car and went inside to meet his brother. Here, Russell asked his brother, Rodney, to come out and talk to him for a moment. Russell asked where Rodney got his betting money. At first, Rodney didn't want to admit it, but because he kept getting pushed, he revealed that he always got loans from a loan shark named Petty. Rodney was finally honest that he owed a lot of money to Petty and hasn't been able to pay it off. Hearing this, Russell was certainly annoyed, but he really loves his little brother, so he didn't have the heart to scold him and be rude. Even Russell promised that when he got paid, he would help pay off Rodney's debt. The next day, Russell went to his father's house, visiting his father who was seriously ill. Russell's father lived with Russell's uncle and Rodney. Apparently, Rodney was a soldier who would soon be assigned to Iraq. One night, Russell went to a bar in the town center. Russell went there to meet Petty, the loan shark. There, when Russell was about to approach Petty, he heard someone threatening Petty because Petty didn't want to cooperate in distributing drugs. And the person who threatened Petty was Harlan, the bandit leader and a former soldier. Harlan was a little annoyed at Russell because he suddenly came in impolitely. However, Russell said that he also had business with Petty. After that, Petty asked what Russell's purpose was in coming to him. Russell immediately gave some money to Petty because he had come to pay off his younger brother's debt. But unfortunately, the money was still not enough, but Russell promised to pay it off after the next payday. Before leaving, Petty served a glass of drink for Russell as a thank you for paying the debt. On his way home, Russell accidentally hit a car that suddenly passed by. The accident killed a child and the mother, who were in the car. However, on the day of the accident, Russell was deemed guilty because he had been drinking alcohol, so he had to spend 3 years in prison. One day, Rodney visited Russell in the prison. Rodney said that their father was still sick and was now being cared for by their uncle, while Rodney would leave for Iraq to carry out his first duty as a soldier. Hearing this, Russell advised his younger brother to always take care of himself during his mission in Iraq. Russell also asked his brother to continue praying for their father's recovery. Some months later in prison, Russell chose not to associate with the gangsters there. It was because he did not want to be involved in any crimes so he could get a remission. But this made several inmates feel annoyed and thought Russell was an arrogant person. One day, 2 inmates came to Russell and immediately ganged up on him. A year passed, and Rodney visited Russell in prison again because he had just returned from duty from Iraq. Rodney reported that their father had died 3 days ago, and hearing the sad news, Russell immediately cried. He felt very sad and guilty because he couldn't take care of his father and instead wasted his time in prison. Long story short, because Russell continued to behave well, he was finally released from prison in a short time. Rodney immediately greeted Russell and was ready to take his brother home. On the way, Russell asked his brother to stop by their father's grave first. That evening, Rodney told Russell that he had left the military because he didn't want to return to serve in Iraq. Hearing this, Russell, as a brother, still supported Rodney's decision. One day, Russell saw his ex-wife, who was now dating a police officer. Russell actually still loves her very much, but he realized that his ex-wife didn't want him anymore. Russell returned to work at the metal factory. Even though he is an ex-con, the factory is still willing to accept him. Meanwhile, Rodney was now a street fighter. He was doing all this because he had to pay off all his debts to Petty. Because while Russell was in prison, Rodney still often borrowed money from Petty. At that time, Rodney should have given in, but instead he continued to beat up his rival because the man had insulted his parents. Of course, this made Petty feel annoyed because he had placed a bet on Rodney's defeat. Rodney could only apologize for breaking their agreement. Then he promised to Petty that he would immediately pay off his debt in another fight. However, Petty thought that Rodney couldn't control his emotions when fighting, so he asked Rodney to just work in the metal factory with his brother. But Rodney instead said that he was embarrassed when he had to work as a factory worker. The next day, at home, Russell found a cloth stained with blood. When he looked at his brother's hands, he finally realized that all this time, his brother had been a street fighter. Russell then asked his younger brother to stop all of this and it would be better for Rodney to come work in the mill with him. But Rodney said that he would be embarrassed if he had to work as a factory worker. Rodney also explained the reason he became a street fighter was because he had experienced depression after returning from Iraq, and the only thing that made him calm down a little was when he fought. A few days later, Russell was determined to meet his ex-wife, who worked as a kindergarten teacher. Russell, who still loved his ex-wife, dared to ask her to fix their relationship again. But with a heavy heart, she refused for some reason. Russell then asked whether the reason we rejected him was because she no longer loved him. But then Russell's ex-wife explained that she was now pregnant with her boyfriend's child. This really made Russell heartbroken and just stuck. On the other hand, Rodney met Petty at Petty's house. Rodney asked Petty to take him to the Ramapos to fight. Ramapos is an area for bandits, and an illegal prize fight was held there. Petty asked Rodney's reason for wanting to fight at Ramapos. Rodney then answered that if he fought there, the prize could pay off all of his debts. Hearing this, Petty still felt sorry for Rodney. Then he explained that the fight at Ramapos was very dangerous. The match organizers often cheat for their own interests. In fact, many of the fighters died. However, Rodney was stubborn, and he continued to force Petty to take him to fight there. He really didn't care at all about the risks. In the end, Petty was willing to comply with Rodney. Then he contacted the match organizer, Harlan. The next day, Russell was visited by his uncle, inviting him to hunt. The heartbroken Russell immediately accepted the invitation, so he could refresh his mind. On the other hand, Rodney had left with Petty, heading to Ramapos and then met Harlan. Arriving there, Petty immediately introduced Rodney to Harlan because he was the one who was going to fight. But Harlan slightly underestimated Rodney's skills because he didn't look like a great fighter. Rodney, provoked by his emotions, said that he was a former soldier. He also immediately invited Harlan to a duel, wanting to prove his prowess. However, Harlan asked Rodney why a soldier wants to fight with his own people, but then Rodney replied that it's all just for money. Harlan told Rodney to leave because he wanted to talk to Petty in private. After they made a deal, Petty returned to meet Rodney, then explained that if Rodney really wanted money, then he just needed to surrender the match they would be holding this afternoon. At first, Rodney refused because he often failed to control his emotions, but this time, Petty really begged him to give in to the match. At the same time, Russell and his uncle had just arrived in the forest to hunt. On one occasion, Russell found a deer and immediately aimed at it, but when he was about to pull the trigger of his gun, suddenly he felt sorry for the deer so he didn't shoot it. Meanwhile, that afternoon, Rodney was going to fight. Before that, Petty reminded him again that he had to give in this match because if Rodney violated this rule, then Harlan's gang would definitely finish them both off. And finally, the fight started. In the middle of the fight, Rodney was provoked by his enemy, so he continued to beat his enemy. Seeing this, Petty was worried that Rodney would lose his control again, so he went downstairs to shout at Rodney. After Petty shouted at him several times, in the end, Rodney wanted to lower his ego. He immediately chose to stay still when he was attacked back by his enemy. On the other side, Russell and his uncle were about to return home, but Russell's uncle managed to catch a prey, while Rodney was being beaten badly, even though he deliberately lost in the match. Luckily, Petty immediately stopped the match and took Rodney out of the arena, because if Rodney continued to be beaten, he could die. Not long after that, Harlan came to meet Rodney and Petty. Here, Harlan immediately gave the money according to their previous agreement. Harlan also thanked Rodney, who was helpless because he almost died in the fight. That same night, Rodney and Petty decided to go home. Petty, who was afraid, deliberately recorded all their conversations while passing through the Ramapos area. But after that, Petty and Rodney were actually ambushed by several bandits, blocking their car. Shockingly, it turned out that the bandit leader was Harlan. At first, Harlan asked Petty to come out. However, Petty refused, so Harlan immediately finished him off. Turns out, Harlan did all this because he had a grudge against Petty, who had previously refused to cooperate in selling drugs. Harlan asked his men to take Rodney to the middle of the forest. Rodney was really helpless, so Harlan immediately killed him, then buried there. On the other hand, Russell, who was already at home, accidentally found a letter written by Rodney. In the letter, Rodney apologized to his brother. He said that this was his last fight and after that, he would work at the mill with Russell. The next day in the morning, a policeman named Wesley visited Russell. He was the boyfriend of Russell's ex-wife. Initially, Russell thought that Wesley would be angry because yesterday, Russell asked his ex-wife to come back to him. But it turned out that Wesley wanted to talk about something else, and he immediately took Russell to the police station. At the police station, Wesley informed Russell that Petty was found dead on a road in the Ramapough area, while Rodney, who was with Petty at that time, had still not been found. The police had also found a recording showing that the perpetrator was Harlan. But unfortunately, people in Ramapough were not willing to cooperate or reveal where Harlan was. Russell doubted the police's performance, so he went to visit his uncle. Turns out, Russell wanted to invite his uncle to look for Harlan in Ramapough. That same day, Russell and his uncle were determined to go there. Arriving there, Russell and his uncle tried to ask Harlan's whereabouts to the people, but unfortunately, they always said that they didn't know. At night, Russell went to a place where the bandits usually gathered. Russell, who was looking for Harlan, pretended to want to buy drugs. At first, they suspected that Russell was a police officer in disguise, but luckily, one of them knew that Russell was an ex-convict he had seen in prison. After that, they took Russell into their base to give him the drugs. After receiving the goods, Russell asked where Harlan was, and suddenly, the bandits were shocked because this was Harlan's base. After finding out where Harlan's base was, Russell rushed to set up a strategy first. But on the way, a policeman approached Russell and his uncle, saying that they had to immediately return home right now, because if Russell came along to interfere with this case, then the police would arrest Russell again. This was because the police were afraid that Russell and his uncle would make a mess of the police investigation. The next day, Wesley came to meet Russell. Wesley said that Rodney had been found dead, and his body was buried in a forest. Wesley promised that he and the other police were going to arrest Harlan, but he begged Russell not to do anything and hand over the case to the police. Russell was finally willing to oblige, and he told Wesley about the location of Harlan's base, which he visited last night. Long story short, the police tried to raid Harlan's base, based on information received from Russell. But unfortunately, Harlan and all his men had fled somewhere. Several months passed, but the police were never able to catch Harlan. This made Russell mad, so he was determined to take revenge on Harlan alone. Russell went to Petty's house to look for Harlan's phone number. Petty's trusted person, Dean, warned Russell not to deal with Harlan, but Russell still did what he did and told Dean to leave this place for 1 week. When Russell managed to find Harlan's number, he immediately called Harlan, asking him to meet at Petty's place at 4 in the morning. Here, Russell reasoned that he would buy a large amount of drugs because he had succeeded in taking over all of Petty's money. Shortly at 4 in the morning, Harlan and one of his men came to Petty's residence. Russell immediately hid to lure Harlan and his men. Inside, Harlan met Dean, even though Russell had warned Dean to leave this place immediately. Russell went inside and immediately attacked Harlan's man. But when Russell wanted to approach Harlan, Harlan killed Dean first and then rushed to run away from the place, but Russell kept trying to chase Harlan. On one occasion, Russell managed to find Harlan and a duel broke out between them. Luckily, Russell managed to win the duel. He shot Harlan in the leg and then told him to walk. While Harlan was walking, Russell shot him again. Russell told Harlan that he was Rodney's older brother, the person Harlan had killed and buried in the forest. Harlan got up then walked, hoping that Russell would forgive him. At the same time, Wesley came and immediately told Russell not to kill Harlan. Wesley also reminded Russell that he could go back to prison if he still killed Harlan. However, Russell really wanted to avenge his brother's death, so without thinking twice, he immediately shot Harlan in the head.
Russell!
After all these incidents, it turns out Russell didn't end up in prison because Wesley covered up yesterday's incident as if he was the one who finished off Harlan.